AI, accelerated cloud adoption, and hybrid work are fundamentally shifting how business gets done. The old way of securing your people, apps, and data doesn't work and scale anymore. To stay ahead, today's organizations need to reimagine their security and networking infrastructure with a cloud-first, unified SASE architecture. Join Palo Alto Networks and leading technologists from across the globe for SASE Converge 2023, a two-day virtual experience, November 15th through 16th, revealing how SASE, powered by advanced AI, can drive better security and networking outcomes. Register today at securityweekly.com/Palo Alto. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Janet Worthington about how DevSecOps is building enough trust for a no-look pass and why focusing on vulns all the time is a distraction from securing what you sell. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, one very short announcement. Follow us on LinkedIn for updates across our organization, for show highlights, and more. You can find us by searching for Security Weekly Productions. Now, Mr. Kinsella, you mentioned at the top, there's a top 10 list out there now. So not to be outdone by the Open Worldwide Application Security Project. This is some other group that has a top 10 list group. Now this group, it's not worldwide, it's just some national security agency. But since you mentioned it, we should probably cover it anyway. So there's my handoff to you. No look past, Mr. Kinsella. Take it from here.
How much time do we have to spend on this?
As much as you can tolerate.
Your org and my favorite org, CISA, also called CISA by some of us. I'm mispronouncing it just because you guys are giving us another top 10 list. Came out with another top 10 list between NSA and CISA. I didn't see anything new and exciting in there personally. It seems like it has a bunch of the same things: eliminate default password, provide high quality audit logs, take steps to eliminate entire classes of vulnerabilities. Half our listeners have gone to sleep because they too have heard all these things before. So yeah. Oh, they mentioned MFA too. They mention FMA. They don't mention if you're going to correctly implement MFA. So that could be interesting. But
that's true, but fortunately, they also had a separate MFA and SSO challenge report that they put together. So once you get past the top 10 list, check out that report. I linked to it in the show notes as well. And I will say slightly begrudgingly, at least the report does have a few areas of some actionable recommendations. But otherwise, as John pointed out, it is much of the same, which is possibly also perhaps a damning observation on the state of AppSec if we're still dealing with much of the same and we haven't figured out how to raise a security awareness by doing anything other than top 10 lists. So let's move on to talking about vulns. So we have a lot of vulns this time, and I have to apologize that a lot of my vulns are in the bowels of C code, with a lot within Linux as well. But I think we can learn about them. Now, there's also some curl, but let's save that for the last. X.org. John, I don't even know if you have a system running X11, the X Windows system.
No,
I see you shaking your
my
head.
sun boxes, yeah. I've put them all to sleep. We were talking before we started recording. I think I think most modern Linux distributions are not running X. They're running Wayland or something else. So, and it's partially because of things like this, right? For many, many years, X11 was either through insecure defaults or bugs was a favorite way to pop systems. And looks like they found another one here from back in the day, Mike.
Another one back in the day, but because I'm trying to actually make these articles relevant, there were a couple of things that did stand out to me. So yes, thank you for the history and a little bit of that background of X. But when I went to look at the patches for these two vulns, these CVEs, had some fixed commits, but they also had some hardening commits. And I did like the idea that the developers were taking the time to not just fix the specific flaw, but say, let's harden some of the code around it. And that seems like a DevSecOps approach. Seems like a good way to do this. Two of the other patches that I read through, one was found by running the test cases for a different CVE through address sanitizer. So I thought that was pretty cool to see that they're taking advantage of Clang LLVM's security tooling to find more flaws, and one was found with Clang's libfuzzer. So it's nice to see fuzzing being successful, and wanted to highlight that as an example of why OpenSSF is investing in fuzzing. We don't need, based on our conversation with Janet, we don't need yet another source of finding here are all the flaws that you have, and let's just go add to that backlog of hundreds, if not thousands. Here's a way to either more effectively find a bug that's going to crash your code, which is what a fuzzer is going to do. It's going to be a quality bug in security or just something to fix. So I wanted to highlight it for that reason, say here's a lesson that we can learn, even if we're not really running our X screensavers anymore.
And I think, don't forget my favorite ants was always fun to run on someone else's desktop, not your own. But for our listeners, I'm just sort of clicking through the fixes and the hardenings as you've been talking about it. The fixes are fair. I mean, all these patches are clean, so they're pretty quick and easy to read. But for our listeners who want to sort of, play that game of look at the fix and go, okay, well, what was wrong? What's going on here? And then, okay, how do you fix it? And then how do you sort of harden your code? That's sort of, step two, take the bigger approach. These look like they'd be good to read. And it's probably also interesting since are also possible because some of these older code bases like X or like the code was written by, one of the problems that the FreeBSD versus Linux argument's always been that like BSD was written by a smaller group of individuals, so there was a more consistent feel across the code versus Linux for a while. The argument is Linus was taking patches from anybody. We know that's not true, but there was a wider collection of people giving patches into that code base. So even though Linus was actually then cleaning that up and sort of making it look good, that was the argument. But this X code is like it's super clean. So I think that helps makes the patches both easier to read and easier to implement. So for folks who are into that thing or want to get into that type of thing.
And I think, you made that comment when we were talking with Janet about, continuing education or how do we, stay up to date and keep those muscles exercised. I think one of the reasons I include these is keeping those muscles exercised by reading other code and looking where the flaw was or how it was fixed, which is also why I pulled in Qualys. They've got some great people looking at like weird dusty corners of like Linux code and C code. They found a Looney Tunables, which is a wonderful named vulnerability of, not necessarily the sky is falling, but within Glibc, which is the tunable capability, is basically some things that you can, some settings you can do to influence the behavior of things like malloc or CPU, some of your hardware or pthreads. So that's the type of thing you'll be tuning. But what they discovered is that in this environment variable, the parsing can go a little bit off if you forget a semicolon or you forget a comma, a separator between two of your key value pairs. So it was really neat to see this. It's another great write-up. Two things that stood out to me is one, it was more exploitable because of some optimization that says with calloc rather than malloc that we're just going to give you some memory that's ready to go. We're not going to initialize it to 0. Whereas like if you're in C++ land as a minor aside, C++ will by default initialize to null, initialize to 0. But hopefully your memory is also being allocated in that way as well. Another thing, anyway, I also want to say this also had fuzzing. Now they discovered this manually, but when they turned the fuzzer towards it, it found the flaw within a few seconds after they had provided a dictionary of tunables for it. So this was something they couldn't magically just say, time to fuzz the code, find the flaw. This is why OpenSSF is investing more broadly about how to hook up fuzzing harnesses to different code, because it does need that context of what is the input. Is this expecting an image? What particular format? Is this expecting strings, etc.? And that's a key part of having fuzzers being useful. So I thought that was some good lessons, just more generally speaking, about security tools.
I've got two separate exploits for this I want to cover since the exploits came out. So Qualys was trying to do the right thing and be quiet and not show the exploit, but I think it took about 4 days before they came out. And it is fairly simple to exploit. But before I go quite there, oh come on, brain. Okay, I'll come back to that. But so the two exploits, and I decided to throw 2 in because they're, like I said, they're C-based, they're fairly simple, fairly easy to follow along. But I thought it was interesting that they're not sort of 2 different authors, and it's interesting to see the sort of difference in writing styles between them. So One is 150 lines. The other one is 140 lines. So you can scan through these pretty quickly if you've got some C skills. Neither one's super complicated, but I think what's interesting. I had read the vulnerability last week when it came out, and then I was reading through the exploits this morning, and it's sort of interesting to think like, can you just look at the exploit without going back and looking at the vulnerability report and figure out what it's trying to do? And that I would say for folks could be an interesting little experiment, because you can sort of see what's going on, but it takes a little bit of time to sort of figure out, oh, that's what they're doing. And one of them, it's a little more clear than the other. And I'm not just talking about comments. It's literally it's C, right? It's a language where you can do one thing probably 10 different ways. So here's 2 different ways to sort of get there. So sort of neat.
It is neat. And I was reading, I didn't include this in today's show notes, but I was reading Risky Business this morning. They were commenting about an article from Google that's giving bounties to end-day vulnerabilities, meaning here is an exploit for a vulnerability that you perhaps didn't find yourself, but their motivation for giving bounties for that is to see interesting and novel exploit techniques so that Google then can see, do we have mitigations in place for this class of technique? And so I think that's as you're describing those C-based exploits for Looney Tunables, that made me think about how interesting it is too, for in fact, why other people are also curious about different ways of being exploited.
And really briefly on that one before we keep going, what I was going to say was on the fuzzing side, this feels like something I might have said before, so sorry if so. But it'd be interesting because this to me has always been the problem with the fuzzers, is there's a setup required. You can't usually just point the fire hose at your code. You're not trying to DOS, right? You're trying to fuzz, so you want a little more intelligence. I'm really curious to see if the GPT assistants would be able to help setting up that fuzzer. So I might go play with that this afternoon. Can I either write a little block of code or bring one of these things into Copilot or the Amazon one? I've used it, I still can't remember the name. But can I bring this code in there and say, hey, this block of code, I want to fuzz it. Can it figure out what those variables are and help me write that? That could be interesting.
You read my mind. I'm glad you brought that up because I neglected to mention it. Just as I have not neglected, though, to include the patch or the exploits for the curl flaw because we don't have it yet. It's another 2 more days. It's October 11th. We're recording on October 9th. But I think we can still talk about it. Now, one of the things I want to say up front, too, is I'm a huge fan of the curl project. We covered its, 20th anniversary a few months ago. And I did include also a quote from the maintainer, Badger, or Daniel Stenberg. This time about that, the security level is a blunt tool. So this isn't the type of thing that necessarily the sky is falling and everybody is going to be having to deal with. But I wanted to approach from the sense of, what if we just weren't worried and had to always scramble in scary ways due to impending doom of vulns or 0 days that are coming? What can we do to prepare? Now, this is a client-side vuln, but it makes me think of things like what kind of egress controls do you have on your network? So typically, I think in the past, some curl exploits or vulnerabilities have been exploited by pointing the command to a server that sends a little bit of extra data or plays around with the protocol a little bit in order to trigger the vulnerability. So this is a little bit different from something like a shell shock or a heartbleed where the servers are sitting out there and you just go ping them. So egress filtering comes to mind. And of course, there's get your bingo cards ready, SBOM, supply chain, et cetera. The asset inventory of just where do I have curl? Because as the project said, the vuln goes back many years. So this probably isn't in HTTP 3, but it might be an HTTP 1, HTTP 2 protocol. But that's where my head went, John. I'm curious, is the sky falling for you? How are you headed to your bunker for curl?
Nah. Thank you and good night. No, I think there's a few things here. So for systems, and it depends, right? There's 2 types of ways this attack is probably going to come out. One is just sort of, I would refer to as drive-by, but the concept of something out there just blasting out a link and hoping to see who clicks on it. It's not quite directly a drive-by, but sort of a broadcast, right? It came out over the weekend. In theory, the Vietnamese government was trying to hack some U.S. diplomats by they were posting a link on Twitter, hoping they would click on it, that type of thing, right? It's not really targeted, sort of, but so that's going to be usually after more low value targets versus I don't necessarily consider myself a high value target, but in some ways I will have my systems that I try to practice what we talk about on here, so that are going to be a little more hardened, a little more secured, what if type things. In those situations, yeah, for me, it comes down to, I mean, I had a system, it wasn't doing a ton, but it was public on the internet. I had a system that was up for, I can't remember the runtime. It was like 1,200, 1,300 days without reboot. So God knows what type of vulnerabilities run it, right? But it was there. You could connect to it from the internet and it didn't get popped. And I think that comes down to, you mentioned egress filtering, obviously ingress filtering. Egress, I'd say, for those of us on the OPSEC side, is probably one of the most undervalued things, right? Do you need to be doing outbound curl, outbound port 80 or 443 or whatever? Do you need any outbound? Or should you just be going through a proxy or whatever else? But then on the hardening side, like when we were talking about this pre-show, I was teasing I was going to go back and get some of my Puppet scripts when I was running a startup many years ago now called Stratosec, where we were doing secure infrastructure as a service for back when Amazon wasn't really doing that. So all my systems were being managed basically with Puppet. So hardening was done through Puppet. And what I didn't say before was I was hardening all our VMs to CIS benchmark level hardening. So CIS benchmark for CentOS and those type of things, including SE Linux. So I was one of those probably 10% of people out there who weren't turning off SE Linux, but actually then watching the logs and when something was not working right, actually going through and creating more SE Linux modules and doing that whole process. So it's doable. It takes a lot of work. But I think those who need, well, good, this is a dumb statement, but those who need to should be doing it. As I said, it was a dumb statement, but the tools are there. It's you can do this with these systems, right? Dear friend of mine who passed away this year, James Flom, had he ran hackers.org for years, and that never got popped for basically the same type of things. He was doing some really crazy stuff like change root, read-only file systems things. So even if you had an exploit, you couldn't get in, but it's possible. So, I guess I'd sort of turn back to you, Mr. Threat Modeler, and say, okay, well, we know there's an exploit coming. We know it's in something very common for HTTP. What type of scenarios where you think that your boxes would be running in this environment or had the possibility to run this, right? Your server shouldn't be responsive to a click-through attack. So it's going to be more, there's URL it's already using, maybe. There's a threat model for you, but that's probably what to think about too.
And I think that's a great point, because you can start to ask, well, one, should we be thinking about SSRF? Because that's already a vuln we should be dealing with anyway. But do our systems, can they be triggered by user-generated either content or events? Is my system going out and pulling down images to use for avatars for our social media system? Is it going and pulling down other types of links? Is it doing previews is it going to a website and training an AI model, for example? So there are a lot of ways that you can, go through and ask your system about what are we building to figure out, do we make those outbound connections? And if so, are we proxying them so we can just inspect and guarantee that we're heading to destinations we either trust or know that we don't trust, but we can monitor? Or are we also doing those from inside, for example, a Lambda, something that's isolated? Talk about the architecture of what's making this connection. So if libcurl is popped, then you don't get access to environmental variables with secrets in them, or root that can go because your container was running root, and these sorts of things. So, and I think the reason I wanted to highlight this, and also it was great to hear you talk about Puppet, is that I would so much rather hear someone spending time on hardening and Puppet rather than dealing through and saying, we fixed every type of vuln that we found that was CVSS score 4.0 or higher. Both of those take time, but one of them I think is much more impactful than the other.
And that actually, it comes back to the X11 story too. Like they had the hardening examples in there. I mean, it has become cliche, but as security people, we talk about defense in depth. And obviously the OS needs to be hardened. There was actually really briefly, there was another OS I was looking at when I was trying to dig up another story here. Wolfie is coming out from, that came out from the Chain Guard guys, that they've done a very, I don't think we've covered it, so maybe next week. It's a very minimal OS that has like SBOM and stuff sort of concepts built into it. But the idea is same as Alpine Linux. If you make that thing smaller and smaller, there's less of a surface to attack. But you can do that in your codes too. And I think that's, I would refine that statement a little bit and say, maybe don't go after the CVSS4s, maybe go look at Puppet or let's see, Salt or Terraform or Ansible or CDK or CloudFormation or Pulumi, or I'm probably missing a few others, but go after one of those 10 million things, Chef.
That's a good list.
Or maybe harden the code also. So yeah, it's take a step back, I think, is the idea. And where's your time best spent?
We're going to have to go back to another article that I had last week we didn't talk about, which was OpenSSF's list of critical systems. And we'll have to compare the OpenSSF list with the JLK list just to see what Mr. Kinsella says. But the other thing that let's switch from talking about C to talking about Python and security improvement, security hardening. Now, talking about C, people can say often like string handling strings are not first-class citizens in C, and thus they are a source of buffer overflows, parsing problems, all kinds of problems, as well as format string exploits. And here are some F strings in Python that caught your attention. And F strings are not a comment on the state of Python. They are actually a very specific type of string. Tell us about this, John.
Yeah, so F strings are string literals. This is coming from their definition for string literals, prefaced with the upper lowercase f, commonly called F strings. And they're formatted string literals in Python. And the idea that they came up with here is, I think it's probably a little bit similar to printf in C. I know there's some of that in Python too, if I remember right. But the idea is like, okay, let's have a string that's actually more than just a string. It has some ability to interpret what's inside that guy. So this concept was there earlier, but it was wasn't fully fleshed out. But in Python 3.12.0, which is just being released, they made those a little more accessible and prevalent and common within the language. So I brought it up here from the point of view of it's not so much that using F strings by itself is going to make things secure, but it's a little more spice sense to me from the point of view of I think we've got to, as we provide more tools like this to a developer, something a developer has to pay attention to, but as we have more things like this, then some of the other issues we've seen from string-based vulnerabilities over the years, either string concatenation or possibly overflows or some other type of things, I think we can de-risk a lot of that type of code by using something like an F string. So that's definitely worth. There's some examples in some basic and crazy examples in the link provided in the show notes. So folks should go take a look at that really briefly. But then also when I was looking at that, caught my eye a little bit further down on the list. A little bit further down the list, I can't even see it right now, but I know it's in here. They're also they're moving to a new form of a new hashing library. And now I'm confused why it's not on this list, but they are moving to come on, Brian, HACL, the Hackle project, which they have gone through and done formal verifications of their hashing code. So instead of the Python guys trying to build that wheel themselves and run a language development team writing security code, they're like, let's let the security guys do that. So I think that's a pretty neat upgrade, which will hopefully also keep Python out of our headlines in the future.
And it is also cool to see like actual production use of a formally verified code. Because I will say anecdotally, I've come across the fun of formal verification if you like math and such things, but I have not seen them translated into many common projects. So that's just a great approach. It's another security approach to see. I'm going to make a segue here, John, to talk about eBPF. And what was interesting is that in our conversation with Janet, she talked about she used an example of a team adopting containers and figuring out how should we use containers correctly, securely, don't run them as root. I think we didn't mention, but probably say we could ask the question, are containers a security boundary? Are they a security control in the first place? And I think listeners can already figure out what John's answer is going to be. But containers weren't created as a security control in the first place. Maybe they're misused or misunderstood as that, but eBPF also wasn't created necessarily as a security control, but it's definitely been used as one, for better and worse, perhaps. Tell us a little bit of that mix.
Yeah, so, and I think this is, I don't know if I would have known the whole of this, but the first version of, when eBPF, the first versions came out, it was definitely not, right? And I think this is probably circa 2016, 17, 18. The initial attempts to use eBPF with either containers or other things for security was, it was a no-go because it was super slow. They went through and they updated the language and they made things better, but still it's faster. But we now have an article from our friends at Trail of Bits talking about the pitfalls of relying on eBPF. And the big sort of shock here is, eBPF was not created for monitoring or security. It's used that way by many folks, but that wasn't the original intent of it. It was, had a little more intent of writing just like programs within the kernel. So this is the first of 3 eBPF stories we're going to have here today. But, it's interesting to see them go through and not just talk through some of the pitfalls of what's in here. It's how it's invoked is a little sort of sketchy. The one which was favorite to me was the amount of data space you have for eBPF is fairly small, 512 bytes for its stack. So if you're going to be doing comparisons, there's probably ways to get around that, right? If you're able, once you know that something is memory limited. But they've got workarounds for these type of things also, which is really great. They're not just sort of pointing out problems, right? That's what we like to do as security people, is show solutions. Limited instruction count, so it can only be so big. And then there's potential for time of check versus time of use issues. And there's 1 or 2 more in here. But the overall point is, you can't just say, well, we're going to use eBPF and be safe. And this is why I think one of the questions I had for Liz when she was on, Liz Rice, was on talking about eBPF previously, was, do we expect people at quote unquote at home, like at your jobs, wherever else, to be writing eBPF scripts? Because it's not as simple as just scribble it. And her response was no, there's now a growing library of these tools out there that are either available or provided by third-party commercial companies. So Mike, I'm going to go ahead and hop over to the second one related to that. So there's a tab I've been sitting on for a while, and it was sitting around even before I found it. So this actually came out in 2021. But the folks that Embrace the Red, it's a pen testing blog, have our red teaming blog to be specific, have an entry on how to do offensive BPF. So they go through, talk a little bit about how BPF works with some pictures in there, and then they go through and have 3 levels of capture the flag type stuff on how to use eBPF to do things which you wouldn't expect. And I think one of the problems with BPF is it's a lot more powerful, and they cover this in the Trail of Bit language. Trail of Bit article also is, since this wasn't specifically created for security use cases or monitoring, there's a lot more power in there with that language. You can actually have it run stuff on your system, execute things, change things around. And sometimes you might want that for maybe packet work. But at the same time, if someone can figure out how to manipulate that's not great. So and I'll shut up after I mention the third one really briefly. For those of you who are considering going to KubeCon, Cloud Native Con in November, I believe it's in Chicago. Yes, on the November 8th. There will be a documentary release there for eBPF, including the aforementioned Liz Rice, excuse me. Too much topic switching. But yeah, so they're coming out this 512
bytes of stack.
Yes, I've just off myself apparently, right? So documentary coming out about eBPF. There's a trailer now in our show notes. I'm looking forward to people who attend and watch that, because at the moment I'm not doing either.
And I had actually also thrown another conference into the show notes as well from Proximo. This is the group behind memorysafety.org. And this one is this week, the end, November 3rd, the first week of November here in San Francisco. And, I more just mentioned it as a resource, and also pointed to Hickory, their Memory Safe DNS that has a new name now. There's a couple other, I'm trying to think of what articles to wrap up here. There was one that I had about, another one on Python that was probably goes into our supply chain area about everybody who's using PyTorch. This is the ShellTorch bug, is potentially now exposed to some critical vulns in PyTorch, and everyone playing with AI. And what stood out to me is that this was a mix. The vulns here were a mix of a default, and a deserialization. So it was sort of just go back to that idea of why as either DevSecOps groups, AppSec groups, etc., are we not giving more attention to that secure by default, secure by design? And because secure by default would have helped more users out here who are running PyTorch, possibly also, and those defaults wouldn't have interrupted with what they wanted to do anyway. So this is just kind of the rant perhaps I wanted to go on, the mini one about secure defaults. And so check out the show notes if you want to know more about ShellTorch. But I think I've exhausted my interest there. Anything on that one, John, or do you want to pick one last one to go?
I think really briefly on that one, and then I'll see if I can pivot somewhere else. One of the problems we've had with security over time from an operational point of view, not so much the developers, but generally users, is you get folks who are not security aware or are security caring that are suddenly trying to, they've got a job, they want to get it done. I think of back from my college days, like grad students who are like, they've got a computer underneath their desk and they're not there to run security on it. But this is sort of the same thing with the data scientists. I'm not trying to slur, but they're not there to, they're there to, as quickly as possible, figure out how to find algorithms and tune these algorithms. And, everyone's talking about machine learning. So the soon as you can get the stuff out there, the better. None of those words I said anything about securing this stuff or the servers that they're using or the data. And we had Microsoft article last week about how they were. So the point being, we really need secure by default on a lot of these things, right? As I said, I'm not trying to slur any of those groups. They're doing what they're there to do, but you can't sort of expect everything out of any of us, including me remembering names. Let's see. If you leave it to me, I would talk briefly about the Cloudflare, the ability to use Cloudflare to bypass Cloudflare. And there's an article which someone came up with. I can't believe we haven't seen someone try and do this many, many years ago already. But it turns out, and I think I've seen it in the past, I didn't go check. But Cloudflare, there's a switch in there which says, as part of your setup, do you want systems protected within this account to be able to access other systems? You see it in VPNs too. But it turns out, however, that's set up in some situations, other customers also fall into that category. So you can have one customer account actually DOS another because it's not going to be protected either by the firewalls or the DOS capabilities of Cloudflare. So an interesting, different type of defaults and different type of configuration and what your sort of trust boundary is. But I thought it could be interesting for our developers to think about when they're writing code. What do you protect, or how big is that sphere of consideration?
Yeah, and I think too, also in the idea of how big is that sphere? What are the steps to exploit this sphere, to enter this sphere? Because there's certain things too that's predicated on you still need to know the IP address of your victim, and that's not necessarily easy to do through Cloudflare. There are various leaks or other ways we've seen demonstrated. And I'm pretty sure that Cloudflare would detect a DOS going through their own systems, trying to DOS one of their own systems. So it's one of those things that not all CVEs, this isn't a CVE, but not all vulns are created equal. And just as we were talking near the top about curl, what was the line? The severity can be a very blunt tool, and not all problems are the same problems to all end users because of what the mitigations are, what are the attack scenarios, what are the threat scenarios, and what are the steps to put this together. So I'm not trying to be dismissive out of hand about the work, but more to include and focus on the conversation AppSec should have. Like, why do we care, or how much do we care, rather than just, here's a vuln, go fix it. And that seems, as we were talking with Janet, just the way that hasn't worked, so let's just stop doing it.
Yeah, I mean, the translation on this one is, are we expecting everyone who's a Cloudflare user to go and, okay, let's spend the rest of today figuring this out so we can give a report to the boss tomorrow and then they'll have an exact... No, probably not.
Right.
And even if you do this and you have an account, I mean, how many accounts would it probably take to actually do the DOS? You probably have to have multiple accounts. And I'm pretty sure that the folks over there we've seen are quite good at automation, and they'd get the whack-a-mole of this down quite quickly.
Yes, but your point still stands about the presentation of this information, the sense of making the UI, making it clear about what do these decisions mean, what do they imply, and what's on by default and what's not. So again, that really great example of user experience and communication within the security realm. And our communication is done, Mr. Kinsella. We've hit our 30-minute, well, a little bit over limit for the news segment, but I want to say thank you, John, for joining me. I want to thank all of the listeners. Thank you once again to Janet as well. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes. And speaking of Synthwave, as I always do at the end, check out Entity from Megan McDuffie. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.